Hello, and welcome to another episode of my Type 35 build. Progress is motoring right along, quite literally as we focus on the engine and transmission which have been squeezed into the body. The engine in question is a BP4W out of a JDM Unos Roadster, which in the US would be a Mazda Miata, and it's backed by a 6-speed manual transmission. There were a lot of engines I thought about using, from a GM Atlas Inline 6 to a GSXR sport bike motor, but the Unos engines just kept calling my name. And I do say Unos because this is a real JDM imported motor. I'd originally planned on a 1.6 liter B6 engine, but I figured it best to jump on up to the 1.8 liter BP4W you're looking at now. At 140 horsepower, and with its variable runner intake, it's unmistakable even at a glance. I mentioned squeezing this motor into the body. If you look down the front, the engine doesn't actually fit inside the engine compartment. I got a plan to deal with it, and it's quite awesome. But for now, there's just a lot of junk hanging off this motor. On the driver's side is the exhaust manifold and its heat shield. They snake their way around a whole host of tubes and hoses in a generally unattractive looking assembly. And the collector dumps out at an angle I'm just not a fan of. Ahead of the exhaust manifold are the power steering pump and AC compressor with all their belting and bracketry, and at this point you can see the AC compressor is almost resting on the frame. Moving to the passenger's side, the frame, the alternator is hanging down at the 7 o'clock position and is backed by a rather large bracket that holds up an almost comically large intake manifold. This is the variable runner intake that was only available for like 2 years. Under what appears to be intake runners curving over the top of the intake itself is a plenum that's actually about the size of a pot roasting pan. Down low, we've got the oil filter, starter, and a whole gaggle of wiring from the car's former life. And behind the motor is the 6-speed manual transmission, which looks pretty cool with all the ribbing cast down the length of its case. There's a lot of electronics and wiring and hoses and such that are going to have to be dealt with on this engine, but once it's cleaned up, I see a lot of potential. And I really like how there's more aluminum on this engine than plastic, because excessive plastic would just ruin the vintage look of this car. But, like I said, there's some areas that are going to need some attention. Like the exhaust manifold and how, I'm not 100% sure on the distance, but how close the collectors are to pointing right at the driver's feet. I don't think they'd be right on top of each other, but still, the exhaust is a little too close for my comfort. So something with a collector in a more forward position is going to be in order, which, along with getting rid of all the unnecessary hoses, will help clean up the driver's side of the engine compartment. Then there's the proximity of the AC pump to the frame, which is kind of amusing. I mean, sure, the car's not going to have AC, but with clearance like this, I'd say that's a good thing. What else do we have? Pulleys, pumps, wires, tubes. This is a really busy little motor when you get to looking at it. I think it'll look good though. Like I say, once it gets stripped down, you just have to look past the present to see the future. Oh, one thing I do get a kick out of. If you look down the barrel of this thing, on the intake side, there's more engine than there is bodywork to cover it. You don't think? It's a 4-cylinder. How big can it be? Then you realize it's not the length, it's the width. The throttle body looks like the barrel of a shotgun. Or maybe one of those 1950 style air conditioners that used to hang off the passenger's door. I guess hanging the intake out in the wind would be like a vintage Ram Air setup. Or At least a good conversational starter, if nothing else. Hey, is that your intake, or are you just happy to see me?